It is story of March 1945. New York Harbor. A cold Atlantic wind swept across the docks before sunrise. Dark clouds hung low over the water. The harbor smelled of salt, diesel fuel, wet wood, and coal smoke drifting from distant ships. Tugboats groaned through the morning fog. Chains rattled. Seagulls screamed overhead. And slowly, through the gray mist, a transport ship approached the pier. Few people on the dock paid much attention. Thousands of military vessels had arrived here during the war. This one seemed no different. But hidden inside were women carrying a secret fear. German women. Enemy nationals. Women who had spent years listening to stories about America. Stories that painted Americans as monsters. Stories that claimed American soldiers hated Germans with a burning passion. Stories that promised humiliation, revenge, and punishment. Now they were finally here. And every one of them expected the worst. The ship bumped against the pier. Metal groaned against metal. Ropes were thrown. Orders echoed across the deck. The women stood silently. No one spoke. No one smiled. Most stared at the floor. Many looked exhausted. Months of uncertainty had carved deep shadows beneath their eyes. Their coats were worn and faded. Their shoes were scuffed. The cold wind cut through the thin fabric and sent shivers through their bodies. Some held small bags containing everything they owned. Others had nothing at all. As the gangway lowered, a strange silence settled over the group. This was the moment they had feared. The moment they had imagined countless times. Several women later admitted they believed imprisonment would be only the beginning. They expected insults. Interrogations. Perhaps worse. One woman quietly crossed herself. Another squeezed a photograph hidden inside her coat pocket. A third stared toward the dock and whispered a prayer. The gangway touched the pier. The journey was over. Or perhaps something entirely new was about to begin. American military personnel waited below. The women froze. Their hearts pounded. Boots echoed against the metal ramp as the first prisoners slowly descended. The harbor wind whipped through their hair. Nobody knew what would happen next. Then something unexpected occurred. Nobody shouted. Nobody struck them. Nobody cursed them. The Americans simply watched. Calmly. Professionally. Almost indifferently. The reaction confused many of the women. This was not what they had been taught to expect. Not even close. Yet the biggest surprise was still waiting. Because after processing and registration, the women were escorted toward a reception building near the docks. Inside, the air felt warm compared to the bitter cold outside. The smell hit them immediately. Fresh coffee. Soap. Clean fabric. Food. Simple smells. Ordinary smells. But to people who had lived through years of war, they felt almost unreal. Some women exchanged nervous glances. Others stared at the floor. It is story of March 1945. Not dangerous. New York just harbor. Strange. A cold Atlantic wind swept across the docks into a different sunrise. Then they noticed clouds hung low. A large object standing against the wall. The harbor smelled of salt, diesel fuel, shiny wood, and completely unfamiliar. Distant ships. The women tugboats groaned. Several stopped walking altogether. Chains rattled. One pointed toward it. Screamed overhead. Another frowned. And slowly, a third through the gray mist, closer. A transport ship approached the pier. Someone whispered in German. Few people on the dock paid much attention. Because nobody of military vessels had arrived here during the war. To every American in the room, no different. Yet to these women, but hidden inside, it might as well have come from another planet. Fear. They stared at it. Women, confused, enemy nationals, curious, women who had spent years listening to stories whether it was military equipment, stories that painted Americans served some industrial purpose, stories that claimed American soldiers it might be part of a communication system. Stories that promised humiliation for processing paperwork and punishment. Every theory sounded reasonable. Every theory one of them expected the worst. An American soldier noticed their confusion. A smile appeared on his face. Not a mocking smile. Orders echoed across the deck. A genuine smile of surprise. No one realized immediately what had smiled. The women surrounding the object had absolutely no idea what they were looking at. Months of uncertainty had carved two worlds collided beneath that small room. Their coats were worn shaped by years of scarcity. Their shoes were scuffed, rationing. The cold wind cut through the thin fabric shaped by industrial abundance that had continued. Some held small bags containing everything between those worlds. Others had nothing in miles. As the gangway lowered, a strange silence settled over the women. The women kept staring. This was the moment they had walked closer. The moment they had imagined next would become one of the most unexpected memories later of their time in America. Imprisonment, but to understand why a simple everyday object could create such confusion. Interrogations. We need to go back. Perhaps worse. Back before New York Harbor. One woman quietly crossed herself before the ship. Another squeezed a photograph surrender hidden inside her coat pocket. Back to a Germany collapsing beneath the weight of war. Because the rail story begins years earlier. The journey where millions of people were learning to survive with less and less was about to begin. And as conditions grew worse, military personnel waited that one day a simple object in America would leave them completely speechless. Boots echoed against the metal ramp as the first prisoners slowly descended. The harbor wind whipped through their hair. Nobody knew what would happen next. Then something unexpected occurred. Nobody shouted. Nobody struck them. Nobody cursed them. The Americans simply watched. Calmly. Professionally. Almost indifferently. The reaction confused many of the women. This was not what they had been taught to expect. Not even close. Yet the biggest surprise was still waiting. Because after processing and registration, the women were escorted toward a reception building near the docks. Inside, the air felt warm compared to the bitter cold outside. The smell hit them immediately. Fresh coffee. Soap. Clean fabric. Food. Simple smells. Ordinary smells. But to people who had lived through years of war, they felt almost unreal. Some women exchanged nervous glances. Others stared at the floor. To understand the mystery that unfolded inside that reception building, New York, we have to travel back several years. A cold Atlantic wind swept across the docks before sunrise. Back to a nation consumed by war. Hung low over the water. By 1943, the harbor smelled of daily life across much of Germany had begun to change dramatically. Drifting from distant ships, many civilians tried to maintain a sense of normality. Chains rattled, remained open. Seagulls screamed overhead. Continued operating. And slowly, through the gray mist, worked day and night. A transport ship approached the pier. Propaganda posters still promised victory. Paid much attention. But beneath the surface, thousands of military vessels had arrived here during the war. Food became harder to find. This one seemed basic household goods but hidden inside were women carrying a secret fear. Coffee was replaced by substitutes. Enemy nationals became a luxury. Women who had spent years listening to stories wore out faster than it could be replaced. That painted Americans families as learned to repair old items stories that claimed American soldiers hated Germans with a burning passion. Every scrap stories that promised humiliation. Life became a constant battle against shortages. Now they were finally here. They stood in long lines. Every one of them expected the worst. Sometimes they waited hours only to return home empty-handed against metal. The smell of fresh bread became increasingly rare. Orders echoed across the deck. Full store. The women stood silently. Even simple comforts disappeared. No one smiled. And then came the bombing. Stared at the floor. At first, many looked exhausted. Stories of uncertainty other cities had carved deep shadows beneath their eyes. Their coats were worn between neighbors. Their shoes were arrived overhead. The cold wind cut through the thin fabric and sent shivers through their bodies. Their haunting wail some held small bags containing everything day or night. Others meals nothing were interrupted. As the gangway lowered, a strange conversation settled over the group. Instantly. This was the moment grabbed they had feared and rushed underground. They had imagined inside crowded shelters. Several women later admitted they believed imprisonment would be only the beginning. Mothers whispered prayers. They expected insults. Dust drifted from interrogations as explosions shook the ground above. One woman nobody knew whether their home would still exist. Another squeezed a photograph for countless German women. Pocket. These experiences became toward the dock and whispered fear was no longer an emotion. The gangway touched the pier. It was a permanent companion. The journey was over. But something even stranger was entirely new was about to begin. The image they had been given of military personnel increasingly distorted. The government propaganda portrayed Americans as ruthless enemies. Boots echoed against the metal ramp speeches, as the first prisoners slowly repeated the same message. The harbor wind Americans were dangerous. Nobody knew what would happen next. Germans. Then Americans would show no mercy. Nobody appeared everywhere. Nobody struck them. Eventually, many people accepted it as the Americans simply watched. After hearing something enough times, professionally becomes difficult, almost indifferent. And yet reality was preparing a very different surprise. Many of the women. As the war entered its final stages, Germany's situation deteriorated rapidly. Yet the entire city lay in still waiting. Transportation processing and registration, fuel shortages toward a reception building. Millions of civilians found themselves displaced. The air felt warm. The winter of 1944 and early 1945 hit them was especially harsh. Fresh cold winds swept through damaged clean fabric. Broken windows were covered with blankets and cardboard. Ordinary smells became precious. But to people who had lived through years of whatever they could find, they felt almost unreal. Furniture. Some women exchanged nervous glances that produced heat. Others stared at the floor. The smell of smoke hung over many neighborhoods. Hunger followed close behind. Meals grew smaller. It is story of March 1945. Red portions shrank. New York Harbor. Mothers worried. A cold Atlantic wind feeding their across the docks before sunrise. Every day felt uncertain. Dark clouds hung every day low over the water. Temporary. The harbor then smelled of salt, final diesel collapse. Fuel. In early 1945, drifting from front lines ships moved rapidly. Tugboats groaned news through the morning from fog. Every direction. Chains rattled. Cities were falling. Seagulls screamed. Armies overhead. Were retreating. And slowly, the war through the gray mist. A transport ship the news brought relief. Few people on the dock paid much attention because surrender meant of military vessels had arrived and many German civilians feared what would happen next. No different. Among them were women who would eventually find themselves transported across the Atlantic. Women. Some had worked in administrative positions. Women who had spent years listening to stories about America. Others simply became caught in the chaos of a collapsing nation. Stories that claimed individual stories hated Germans, but they shared one thing. Stories that promised humiliation. Nobody knew what tomorrow would bring. Now they were finally here, impossible to predict. And every one of them expected when they entered Allied custody. The ship anxiety followed them everywhere. Metal rumors spread quickly among prisoners. Ropes were thrown. Stories circulated through camps across the temporary holding centers. The women stood silently. Some claimed Americans treated prisoners harshly. No one smiled. Others claimed conditions were fair. At the floor. Nobody knew what to exhausted. Information traveled had carved deep shadows beneath their eyes. Speculation. Their coats were worn and faded, and their shoes usually won. The cold wind cut through the thin fabric and sent shivers through their orders arrived. Some held small bags would be transported overseas. Others to America. Had nothing at all. The announcement as the gangway many of the women. A strange silence settled over the name itself carried enormous emotional weight. For years they had existed mainly as an enemy nation. Several women later admitted they believed imprisonment would be only the beginning. The voyage began under gray skies. As the transport ship pulled away from Europe, many passengers crowded along the rails. Crossed herself. Some stared silently at the disappearing coastline inside her coat pocket. Others cried. A third stared toward the dock goodbye and whispered a prayer. Not because they expected anyone to see them. The journey was they did not know if they would ever return. Entirely new was about to begin. Was long. American military personnel waited below. Days blended together. Froze. Cold winds swept across the decks. Boots echoed against the metal ramp as the first prisoners slowly descended, mixed with seawater. The harbor wind whipped metal surfaces groaned constantly. Nobody knew what would happen next. At night, then something unexpected across the horizon. Nobody shouted. Many women spent hours talking quietly. Nobody cursed them. Sharing fears. The Americans simply sharing memories. Calmly. Sharing rumors. Professionally. Again almost and again the same questions. The reaction confused. What would America be like? This was not what they had been taught to expect. Would they ever see home again? Not even close. Nobody had answers. The biggest surprise and the uncertainty felt worse because than any processing and registration. One evening, the women were escorted toward a reception building near the docks. An older woman described stories she had heard. The air felt warm compared to the bitter cold American cities filled with electric lights. Immediately. Stories about stores overflowing with products. Clean fabric. Stories about endless abundance. Simple smells. Several listeners laughed nervously. But to people who had lived through years of war, they felt almost unreal. How could any nation possess such wealth while Europe struggled simply to survive? At the floor. The conversation faded. Most dismissed the tales. Soon they would discover those stories had not been exaggerated at all. The first glimpse of America arrived before dawn. Passengers gathered on deck despite the cold. The harbor slowly emerged through fog. Buildings appeared. Ships. Cranes. Lights. The scale of everything seemed enormous. Industrial. Powerful. For women arriving from war-ravaged Europe, the sight felt almost unreal. Nothing appeared damaged. Nothing appeared broken. There were no bomb craters. No collapsed buildings. No shattered streets. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Some stared silently. Others exchanged bewildered looks. One woman reportedly whispered, "It looks untouched." Because it was. While Europe had burned, America had remained largely beyond the reach of destruction. That story would soon become impossible to miss. New York after disembarking, a cold Atlantic wind swept across the docks before sunrise. Identification checks, dark clouds hung low examinations. The harbor smelled of procedures, diesel fuel. Yet even during these first hours, smoke the women noticed details that caught their attention. Groaned through the morning fog. Bright lights rattled. Fresh seagulls screamed overhead. Equipment and slowly, simple through the gray mist, ordinary transport ship approached the pier. Things that had become increasingly rare in wartime Germany. At thousands of military vessels had arrived here isolated examples. This one perhaps the Americans were merely presenting a favorable women carrying a secret evidence fear accumulated German everywhere. Enemy nationals seemed generous. Women who had spent years listening to stories about America. The supplies stories that painted Americans. The women struggled to reconcile stories that claimed American soldiers everything they had expected with a burning passion. Then came the moment that nobody promised humiliation. Inside the reception area stood a large machine. Now they were finally here, polished, and every one of them expected by American standards. The ship bumped against the pier, completely unfamiliar to many of the women staring at it. Ropes they gathered around, orders examining every detail. The women stood to understand its purpose. No one spoke. What is it? No one smiled. The question spread through the group. Stared at the floor. Nobody knew. Many looked exhausted. One woman suggested it might have uncertainty had carved deep shadows beneath their eyes. Military equipment. Their coats were worn and faded. It was some kind of communication device. The cold wind cut through the thin fabric and sent shivers through their bodies. American personnel small bags containing everything they owned. Not because the women nothing at all. Foolish. As the gangway lowered, genuinely had a strange silence settled over the group. The machine was a vending machine. They had feared. A simple vending machine. They had imagined a common sight throughout much of America. Several women later admitted they believed imprisonment would be only the beginning. The concept seemed obvious to Americans. Interrogation. But for women who had spent years in a nation consumed by shortages, quietly crossed herself, destruction, another squeezed a photograph. The idea felt inside her coat pocket. A machine that automatically stared toward the dock and whispered a prayer. Without standing in line, touched the pier. Without ration cards, the journey was over. Without shortages, perhaps something entirely new was about to begin. Their recent experiences. American military personnel waited in disbelief. The women others laughed nervously. Their hearts pounded. One reportedly asked whether the machine the metal actually worked. As the first prisoners slowly demonstrated. The harbor women watched closely. Their hair. A coin nobody dropped. Knew what would happen. A mechanical next. Click echoed. Then something inside. Unexpected moments occurred. Later, an nobody item shouted. Simple. Nobody struck them. Ordinary. Nobody routine. Cursed them. Yet the reaction was extraordinary. Calmly, for a few seconds, professionally, nobody spoke. Almost indifferently, the machine represented something larger than many of the women. It represented this was not what they had been taught to expect. Convenience, not even close. A world untouched by years of desperate still waiting. And because the surprises after processing were only registration. Because what happened over the following weeks would challenge even more assumptions. Inside, the air felt warm compared to the bitter cold outside. Instead, they encountered professionalism, fresh coffee. Some expected punishment. Clean Instead, fabric. They received food, medical care, simple smells. Some expected humiliation. Ordinary smells. Instead, they experienced people who had lived ordinary human interaction. They felt almost unreal. Perfect. Some women exchanged nervous glances, free from tension. Others stared at the floor, far different from what they had imagined. Each day created new contradictions. Each day forced them to reconsider old beliefs. And the real surprise had not yet arrived. Because beyond the vending machines, the clean facilities, and the abundant supplies, they would soon discover something even more difficult to understand. The possibility that the enemy they had feared for years might not be the enemy they had imagined at all. It is story of March 1945. The strange machine that had once gathered a crowd of confused German women gradually became just another part of sunrise. The dark clouds had hung low over the water. The curiosity the harbor smelled of salt, diesel but the memory remained. Wetwood, and years later, drifting many of those women would forget the names of groaned through the morning fog. They would forget dates. Chains rattled. They would forget seagulls conversations overhead. Yet some never forgot through the gray mist moment of a transport ship approached the moment they stood before an ordinary American vending machine much attention and realized they had entered a world military vessels from the one they had known during the war. At first glance, this one seemed like a small story, but hidden inside were women carrying a secret fear, a cultural surprise. German women, nothing enemy more. Nationals, but beneath the surface, women who had spent years listening much stories about America. The machine itself stories never that painted Americans as monsters. The real story was stories that claimed American soldiers, 4 years, Germans. These women had lived inside a country stories that promised humiliation. They had watched shortages and punishment spread across Germany. Now they were finally here. They had stood in ration lines. And every one of them expected the worst. Empty shelves. The ship bumped. They had learned to repair old clothing metal instead of buying new garments. They had measured food carefully. Orders echoed across the deck carefully. The women stood every meal carefully. No one scarcity shaped their daily lives. Every decision at the involved limitation. Many looked exhausted. Every comfort became months of uncertainty had carved every deep shadows carried their eyes. Then they arrived were worn in America and faded, and suddenly they encountered a society operating under completely different fabrics and sent shivers through their bodies. Where machines dispensed small bags containing everything they owned. Where stores remained others stocked. Had nothing at all. Where factories continued producing goods on a massive scale. Silence settled where over abundance the existed. This was the moment they had never imagined. The moment they had imagined was impossible to ignore. Several women later admitted they believed imprisonment would be only the beginning. Something even more important happened during their time in American custody. Perhaps slowly, many began questioning the image they had been taught to believe. Another squeezed a photograph. They had heard stories describing Americans as cruel enemies. Stared toward the dock. They had expected hatred. The gangway expected revenge. The journey had expected violence, or perhaps something entirely new was about to begin. Far more complicated. American military personnel waited below. Not universal kindness. Not a fairy tale, but ordinary human beings. The metal ramp as the first prisoners slowly descended. The medical workers who treated illnesses. Nobody knew what would happen next. Paperwork. Then something unexpected occurred. Brief conversations. Nobody shouted. People who, despite being wartime enemies, cursed them. Often behaved in ways that contradicted years of propaganda. Calmly. This realization was not almost immediate. Indifferently. Old beliefs rarely disappear overnight. Many of the women. Fear does not vanish because of a single experience. Distrust does not evaporate after one conversation was still waiting. But day by day, because after processing and registration, the women were escorted toward a reception building. Many began seeing the world differently. Inside, the enemy no longer appeared warm as compared to the bitter cold outside. The enemy became human, hit them immediately. And perhaps that was the greatest surprise of all. Because war depends heavily on distance. Simple smells. Distance between ordinary smells. Distance between people who had lived through years of war. Distance between they felt people. Almost unreal. The greater the distance, some women exchanged it becomes to simplify others. Others stared at the floor. To hate them. To misunderstand them. But when people finally meet face to face, reality often becomes more complicated than propaganda ever allowed. The German women were not heroes. The Americans were not perfect. History is rarely that simple. World War II remains one of the most devastating conflicts in human history. Tens of millions lost their lives. Entire cities disappeared. Families were destroyed. Communities were shattered. The suffering reached nearly every corner of the globe. Nothing about that reality should be minimized. Yet within enormous historical events, smaller human stories still matter. Stories that reveal how individuals experienced history. Governments, no one spoke, and those subjects matter. No one smiled. But sometimes the most revealing stories occur far away from battlefields. Months of uncertainty had carved deep shadows beneath inside a reception center. Their coats were worn inside and faded. A conversation. Their shoes inside were scuffed. A moment of confusion. The cold wind cut through the thin staring at a machine and sent shivers through their bodies. Simple question. Some held small bags containing everything they owned. Never really about others the machine. Had nothing at all. The answer was about the gangway lowered. A strange silence settled over the group. About the distance between what people are told and what they eventually discovered they had imagined countless times. And perhaps that lesson several women later admitted they believed imprisonment every generation inherits stories about other insults, other interrogations, other cultures, worse, other enemies. One woman quietly crossed herself. Those stories are another squeezed a photograph. Sometimes they are inside her coat pocket. Sometimes they are entirely wrong and whispered a prayer. The challenge is finding the courage to look beyond them. The journey was over. To observe, or perhaps something entirely new was about the German women who arrived American in America military in 1945 waited below one reality. The women encountered another. Their that experience did not erase the horrors of against war. The metal ramp. It did not first prisoners slowly descended. But it reminded them of something important. Nobody even during humanity's darkest conflicts. Then reality is often more complicated than fear allows us to believe. Nobody and perhaps that is why this forgotten story still matters. The Americans simply because behind every uniform is a human being. Stories that show how ordinary people navigated extraordinary circumstances. Stories that remind us that large events are ultimately made up of countless personal moments. It is a story of March 1945, a misunderstanding, New York Harbor, a discovery, a cold Atlantic vending wind machine swept across the docks. Small moments can sometimes reveal larger truths. Hung low over the water. The women who stood inside that reception building in 1945, wetwood, the machine represented more than convenient ships. It represented the collapse through the morning fog. The beginning of questions. Seagulls the realization that reality could differ dramatically through the gray expectation. A transport and that realization stayed with many of them long on the dock after the war paid much attention. Eventually, thousands of military vessels had arrived here during the war. This Germany itself had changed, but the nation they returned to women was rebuilding from ruins. German women required enemy nationals, families women who had missing relatives, listening to stories entire communities struggled to create stories that painted Americans as monsters. The process stories that claimed American soldiers hated Germans with a burning passion. Yet memories of America stories that remained part of their personal history, revenge, and not because of grand now they were finally here. Not because every one of them expected the worst, but because of simple experiences that challenged deeply against metal. History books often focus on battles echoed across the decks. The women stood silently. Behind almost every nation are ordinary reaction people, confused and behind many every war are countless individuals what they had trying to survive. To expect. In the end, not even the strange object that confused those women was never the most remarkable part of the story. Because after processing the most remarkable part was what they learned escorted toward a reception building near the docks. If you enjoyed this hidden World War II story, the air felt warm compared to the bitter cold outside, and join us for more forgotten stories from history. Immediately. Fresh coffee, soap, clean fabric, food, simple smells. Ordinary smells. But to people who had lived through years of war, they felt almost unreal. Some women exchanged nervous glances. Others stared at the floor.